Welcome back to the next presentation in our series designed to help businesses making small amounts of hazardous waste comply with New Hampshire's rules. This presentation is for those businesses that have at least 220 pounds of non-acute hazardous waste stored at their site. If you remember, 220 pounds is roughly equal to half of a 55-gallon drum of a liquid like water. Some wastes are a lot heavier than others, though. For instance, a drum of damp rags will weigh a lot less than a drum of waste acid, so you have to consider your particular situation to figure out how much of your waste is equal to 220 pounds. If you checked yes in the box at line 16 in section E, you said that you have at least 220 pounds of hazardous waste being stored at your facility. Because you have a larger amount of hazardous waste at your site, you have a greater risk. If there's a fire, bad chemical reaction, or a release of hazardous waste at your business, there will be more wastes involved and likely more damage as a result. So it makes sense that we should take extra precautions to prevent those accidents from happening. A standard concept in hazardous waste regulation is that the more waste you have, the more rules you have. The extra rules in your case are shown on this extended accumulation checklist. The first requirement on this checklist is to inspect your waste storage containers weekly. Again, if you have more waste, there's more risk, so we take steps to make sure that containers in good condition stay in good condition. It also helps us to notice any leaks, releases, or other dangerous conditions before they become a big issue. Your inspection checklist doesn't have to be anything elaborate. Make a list of items to check for, things like spills, leaks, and those items listed in section E of this form. Make a bunch of photocopies, put them on a clipboard near your storage area, and fill them out each week. Make a habit of it by doing the inspection at the same time on the same day of the week. Maybe it could be the first thing you do after your morning coffee on Monday, just to ease into the week, or the last thing you do before you leave for the weekend. The second item, number 2, asks about inspections of tanks storing hazardous waste. Although it isn't always true, tanks are usually bigger and hold more waste in one place. They're more complicated too, with pipes, fittings, and valves, making it more likely that something will go wrong. Because of this, you're required to inspect tanks daily instead of weekly. The good news is, very few small quantity generators have tanks, but if you do, use the same ideas I mentioned in the previous slide to help you be successful in doing your inspections. By the way, a reminder, if the tank is holding used oil or antifreeze to be recycled, you don't have to inspect them. Once in a while, it's hard to tell if something is a container or a tank. If you aren't sure, drop us a line and we'll help you figure it out. Next, in item 3, we ask that you have someone who is identified as the go-to person for any issues with hazardous waste. We want to make sure that managing this stuff isn't just a bunch of finger pointing where everyone thinks somebody else was supposed to take care of it. Who's responsible for inspecting the storage area? Who signs the manifest when this stuff is shipped? In short, who's responsible? Often, this is the business owner, but really it depends on the size of the business. Whatever the case, prove that you have someone with this responsibility by writing their name on line 3. Item number 4. Does the facility have a designated emergency coordinator who's either on premises or on call with the responsibility for coordinating all emergency response measures. We use the term emergency coordinator to describe the person who's in charge of handling any emergencies, such as spills, releases, or fires related to hazardous waste. This could be the same person that's responsible for other hazardous waste management at your business, the person we just identified in the previous question, but it doesn't have to be. The goal is to think about emergencies before they happen, identify a person who will take charge, and make the immediate decisions, and make sure there's someone who works at the facility or lives close by. Again, this is often the owner of the business. If your business is big enough that you can hire an emergency response company to take care of spills and fires, that's great, but you won't meet this requirement if they're located 100 miles away. Has to be someone who works at the facility. Number 5 asks if you have a phone that can call emergency responders, like your local fire company. Nowadays, pretty much everyone has a cell phone, and landlines are becoming things of the past. If you rely on a cell phone to meet this requirement, and you're ever inspected, you'll be asked by the inspector to prove that it works. So be sure to check regularly. Remember, too, that this phone is supposed to be within 100 feet of the storage area. Item number 6 asks if you have some kind of building alarm to tell employees when to evacuate. In a single, small building that isn't very noisy, your voice might meet this requirement. But if you have multiple buildings, it's a big facility, or it's really noisy, some kind of device like a horn, siren, paging system, or other way to alert folks will be necessary. On to item 7. We've all had moments in our lives when we were in a panic situation and we struggled to think straight. For that reason, we require that the telephone mentioned in item number 5 has a list of numbers to call in an emergency right next to it. This includes the emergency coordinator and the State of New Hampshire Emergency Response Team. For your information, the number for the emergency response team is 271-3899 during normal business hours. After hours, they can be reached through the state police by dialing 223-4381. In addition to the phone numbers, describe or have a map of where fire extinguishers and spill control materials are located, as well as any emergency fire alarm if you have one. Here's an example of what that phone posting might look like, and those 2 emergency phone numbers I just mentioned. Here's another example of how you might show where your emergency equipment is located. This works well if you're a visual person like me. Are your employees trained? While we said we want you to identify a single person who is ultimately responsible for managing hazardous waste, we also want every employee involved in hazardous waste handling or management to understand what they're supposed to do. While a formal training program is a great option, it's not necessary or even a workable idea for every business. But how much training is enough training? A small business with few employees should consider whether, if an inspector was on site, could the employees properly describe what they're supposed to do where hazardous waste is concerned? If asked, will they know where hazardous waste should go, what is dangerous about it, and what steps they need to take to stay in compliance with their particular responsibilities? Not every employee needs to know everything, but they need to know what their role is. I'll add also that to an inspector, if there are a lot of problems with mishandling of hazardous waste at your site, it's a sign of inadequate employee training that might cause them to ask more questions. Emergency responders like your fire company, police department, and hospital are there to protect you, your neighbors, and your livelihood. Give them every opportunity to do that by providing them up front with information about what stuff you have at your site and what you do with it. Document what kind of chemicals and hazardous wastes you have and where you keep them in the building. Tell them where employees tend to be located and give them a drawing of your building layout. We also suggest you put the icing on the cake by inviting them to your business for a tour. If they aren't interested, at least you did your best. Here comes the tricky part, though. Document that you tried to provide this information to them so you have proof. It's such an easy thing to put off or forget that we look for documentation so we know you gave it the good old college try. If you send them this information in an email, get a read receipt. If you hand deliver it, get them to provide you with a signed statement of receipt in return. If you send it by regular mail, we suggest using a read return receipt, a card provided by the U.S. Postal Service that the recipient signs when they get the letter delivered to them. Then keep that card on file as proof that you did your part, so you can show you made every reasonable effort to inform your community emergency responders. Item number 10. We said that if you have 220 pounds or more of hazardous waste, you have to follow these extra rules. We also want you to know that if you have 10 times that amount, 2,200 pounds, that you have even more rules. And that means that you have to get that hazardous waste shipped off-site within 90 days, or you'll be held to all of the requirements for full quantity generators until you do. To be honest, there are a lot of rules for full quantity generators, and you don't want that if you can avoid it. So make it a point to ship your waste off-site before you have 2,200 pounds. Oh, and a quick reminder. You don't have to include used oil for recycle or universal waste when you're figuring out how much you have stored at your facility. You've finished the extended accumulation checklist. Well done. Now it's time to go back to page 5 and sign off on the form so we can put this to bed. If you need a little extra guidance, go back to the presentation for page 5. Remember, if this form still has you confused, feel free to go back and watch any of these presentations again. Or you can give us a call at one of these numbers during normal working hours, or send us an email. Please leave a message if we don't connect, and we'll return your call. If you prefer email, you can reach us at sqg@des.nh.gov.